Hi, today I'm talking to Dr. Fiona Crichton, who will tell you why she's a doctor. She's actually got a doctorate in health psychology, with her thesis was on medically unexplained symptoms resulting from, well, supposedly from wind farms, but she can explain all that. Before that, she was a lawyer, and I met her when she and I were both on the board of Eden, which was Eating Difficulties Education Network. So I'm just going to let Fiona start by telling us just a bit of a summary of her life, where she's been to, what she's doing now, and anything she wants us to say. And then we'll talk a bit about, things like achievements, difficulties that she has come across, how she dealt with those and overcame them, I'm sure. And then we'll get on with a couple of other things. So Fiona, it's all yours.
Oh, lovely. Thank you for inviting me. That's really exciting. It's nice to spend some time talking about myself. I spent the last hour thinking about the kinds of things that you'd asked me to think about. And I realized that being a woman in the kinds of professions, particularly law, has been an interesting one. I was thinking about the fact that when I joined law school, which would have been in the 1980s, that was maybe the first time that there were 50% women in the law school. So were you in there in the 70s, Janet?
Yeah, and then I finished my professionals in the early 80s, 82, I think. Okay. And we've gone from 10% up to 50% in that 10-year period.
So it was an interesting time. I think that there was a little bit of complacency for my generation around that whole idea of what was available to us as women. And I think what happened was I grew up in the 70s in provincial New Zealand, in Napier, at that time where we were told girls could do anything. And my dad was very much a proponent of that, and the whole idea of how do you assess how well someone's doing in the world? You assess whether or not they can read and they can write at an early age. And I think those achievements favor girls.
Yeah.
So I already had this feeling that kind of being a girl was better than being a boy. I really believed that growing up in the 70s. And I look back at the photos that we had, and we all wore elasticized trousers and skivvies, and we looked shocking. We didn't wear shoes. So we had kind of very gender neutral clothes in the 70s. So I think it was pretty easy to believe that we'd kind of done it, that we'd made it. I look back and I realize how foolish that was, but I know that by the time I hit university in the mid-80s, there was a very big feminist movement at the university, and I would have rolled my eyes at that, because I think, because I think that I felt that, come on, let's just get over this. I was very much of that. The way that I've been brought up was to be very respectful of the generation above me that were not so enlightened. So once I was in law school, there was a lot of sort of discussion about the fact that some of our male lecturers had very little to do with women, and some of them appeared to be quite sexist. But my feeling was that once these guys moved out, that the new generation, it would just be, we wouldn't even have to have those conversations.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yes.
And then I thought about it some more, because having had children and being now 20, 30 years later, and realizing that a lot of the things that we thought that we'd overcome, that we haven't. And I think that's particularly so in law. I think that given that we were 50% in sort of 1985, 86, you would have thought that by the time you were in the 2010s, that you'd see more women as partners, that you would see more women on boards. And that's not what's happened at all. No. And I think, so I've been thinking a lot about when I hear some of the conversations that my children have, which they're now in their 20s themselves. So they're sort of at the age I was when I was first practicing law. And the things that they say are the things that I thought we'd never have to deal with again. Yeah, and it's quite interesting. So they very much felt as they were growing up, and they went to an all-girls school, both of them, that boys had an advantage over them, even though they were at a girls' school. It was so surprising to me. And that boys are louder in a room by the time they get to high school, that you're kind of fighting to be seen and fighting for place. And that my younger child has expressed to me their thought that boys were even maybe seen by the world as being better, which is something I was astonished by. And I thought about why that might have been, and I do think that that kind of pop culture that happened while my kids were growing up, which was very much the sort of Britney Spears time, the way that kids dressed, the kind of pop culture that we were exposed to with with TV programs that I watched with my kids. I thought they were great. They often treated women, they were high school dramas like One Tree Hill, which we as a family really loved. But I think that I look back and see some of those girls, they were portrayed in a way as though that they got their validity through being attracted to boys,
yep.
to being kind of a little bit less than, and the way that they looked and the way that they dressed. And while my kids were teenagers, they were watching that.
Yeah,
which I don't think I had. So, given that we've come to where we are right now, where we feel like, I don't know about you, but it feels like we've gone back to some like the 1950s in ways, some of the conversations that we're having. And often those conversations are now with younger boys and girls. You think, oh, okay, so how did this happen? Was it that the generation, my generation, that were 50% of us were in law school, did we drop the ball somewhere along the way? And what my attitudes, which was basically, look, once we get these dinosaurs out of the law school, it'll all be fine. That was the naive thought that I had. And I really didn't want to have those uncomfortable conversations because I didn't even think that they were necessary. The idea that you would start to say, even making a fuss. So I had a conversation. Yeah, I mean, we didn't. And I had a conversation with my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, and she's a young lawyer, and I asked her if she thought, I remember when we first started at law firms, and the difficulty you have is that you're supposed to schmooze the clients. Remember that? You go out and you have a drink with the clients, and you're young. It's not even a graduate degree law. You're out there at 21, 22, so you're young, well, very young, and social anyway. And we were seen as succeeding if clients liked us. And let's face it, most of the clients were male. And there was an underlying sort of unwritten rule that you were doing well if the male clients liked you and wanted to sort of socialize with you more. You were told not to drink too much, but, to make sure that they felt special. These were kind of unwritten things, but happened in the law firms that I worked in. And made me really uncomfortable. And I asked her if she thought that that was a problem now. And she said, yes. I just,
God, yeah. I just keep feeling that we've not only not advanced, we've actually taken a couple of steps backwards because of the sort of abuse that women now get on social media. And then when you get someone like Trump in as president who makes it all right to talk like that,
I genuinely think that that's part of the problem, that now we have these ideas that have been swirling around and haven't gone away, but people knew that they couldn't express them, that you weren't allowed to go around and basically say, especially I think some of the rhetoric around sexuality and ethnicity. I think the girl stuff's been there for a while. I think that people have been, I think the hard thing for me is I went from being a lawyer and went from being someone who was sort of in control of my life to going back to study.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found at the university in the department that I was in is that a lot of those attitudes are still there. I mean, those dinosaur attitudes, or the way that you talk about women, are still there. And in an environment which is supposed to be much more, at least on the surface, careful about how we talk to young women. But it seems like there are rules, and then there's the way that people work. And so you'd hear as jokes things like, yeah, I've heard the most sexist things that's said in my department. And it's hard to, I always confronted it, but as a mature person, and but in a joking way, when you come across those conversations that are having, it's really hard to be the person in the room that says, hey, come on guys, don't be like that. So it's said in a way that it's a joke. I read on Twitter yesterday, Guy Williams say that a lot of comedians come up to him to say that people are too politically sort of PC these days and you can't make racist jokes anymore because they're not jokes. And it's like he made a comment which I thought was really insightful, is you can, but just don't expect people to like you or want to hear your work. And I think that there's an acknowledgement that you're not supposed to say these things, but that people, they still feel them and they still want to say them, and now they're being given permission to say them. And we could easily have lived our entire lives and not realized it was still there, because you and I, we have friends that think the same way that we think. You associate with people that think the way that you at our age, we don't want to have people in our lives that are not progressive in the way that they're thinking. But I didn't even know that it was progressive. I just thought that's the way that that we'd got there, that really the dinosaurs were the dinosaurs. And so it's been interesting to see the young men that my girls know, and hear some of the things that they think. I think that it's been challenged. They're being challenged a little on it, but there have been things that these young guys have said, like they feel that they're kind of the minority now, white young males, that they are discriminated against in a way that it seems completely unfair to them, which you can laugh at because it's ridiculous, but it's also a mark of what happens when they get on social media and they can get those.
Because that's where that's coming from.
Yeah. And I think that the idea for them is that, I guess it's that thing when you have privilege and then you're asked to share your privilege, it feels like you're losing something. And so their takeaway is it's hard to be a young white male because everyone's down on us. And it's like, oh, okay. That's a very tricky conversation to have. You can tell the young ones, it's harder with the older ones, because I've had that conversation with my father-in-law, and he definitely does not feel like someone who has privilege, because he's a man who's, been blue collar his whole life. He's struggled for everything. In many ways, it's true that I've had a much more privileged life than he has. And that's true of my education, my background. But so it's hard for him to understand when I talk to him about things like voting for Trump. We live in New Zealand, we don't get to vote for Trump, and it's great, but you have heard some of the same conversations that they were having in the States. So around the time of the election, I got very exercised, and I tend to be very aware of American politics because my kids spend time in America. My youngest daughter has lived there, and my eldest daughter is just about to go and live there. And I was listening to, my children had told me that my father-in-law watched Fox News and that they told him off and that he really supported Trump. And so I thought that I would be able to confront him and be able to persuade him of the error of his ways. The way I decided to do that was I read something, I think it was like a Slate piece, which was a really kind of comedic takedown of, I think, the second debate between Trump and Hillary, and explaining the things that Trump could have said that made sense, but instead he was, a misogynist, idiot, dotty old racist. And I read this very clever piece that had been written in what I think was Slate, and was laughing away at sort of the idiocy of the things that had been said. And my hope was that he would just listen to what I had to say, and at the end of it, he'd go, "You're right. Hillary's a much better choice." Even though it was theoretical, clearly he's not voting. And I realized as I was talking that I'd lost him.
Yeah.
And at the end, I said to him, and this is the thing that I think I learned the most in the last year, I said to him, when we started to argue, and I could see I wasn't making any headway, and I said, look, the only people that are supporting Trump are uneducated white men. So my point in saying that was that if you knew something, you wouldn't support him, and that if you were someone who had not had the same privileges, you wouldn't support him. But all he heard, and that was such a legitimate thing for him to hear, was I was saying that him as a person, his point of view was not worth anything, and that if only his type of people were supporting it, it must be wrong, which is clearly the stupidest way to have a conversation. And he said at the end of it, because I didn't hear it until I thought about it afterwards, because I realized how ridiculous that was. And by insulting someone, you're never going to get them to agree with you. But also that he said it's really dangerous to have an opposite opinion to you. And I still, because I'm right, Janet, clearly. Like, how could anyone have an opposite opinion to me? I had to go and think about the way that I present my arguments, but I still was kind of fairly complacent because I didn't for a minute think that Trump would win. And when he did win, it was a moment of me going, okay, I had an opportunity to have a conversation with somebody who thought differently from me, and all I did was alienate him and actually probably make him more inclined to go, get out of here. I'm going, you know, I realized it's not just a question of talking past each other. We are so right. I am so right that I can't hear when someone's telling me something that obviously matters and resonates with them, because it feels so ridiculous to me that they would even think that way.
Yeah.
So I think we do live in interesting times, and then you have that whole thing where you can go on the internet and you can find anything that supports what you believe.
Yes, and that's it, and that's all you read.
And that's all you read.
Yeah.
And so we have algorithms with our social media, which is very clever, so that you click a link, like if you're someone like me who does work in climate change denial, I'm clearly someone who supports the idea that anthropogenic climate change is a thing, and I am constantly reading articles about this. And Facebook and Twitter and other social media outlets, they know that, they have an algorithm. And so you know when you click onto Facebook and you read something from The Guardian, and underneath it will say you might like this, or suggested pages.
Yes. Yeah.
And very often those suggested pages will be things that reinforce that very view. So at the end of the election, because a lot of my research has been about internet misinformation, I was really interested in our access to information. And there was a Guardian article that I didn't read the source material, but someone had done some research to show the algorithms that dictated. My husband is just coming. Stop. He's put me off. An algorithm that dictated the kind of information that you would get. So if you were a conservative in the States, you would get very different information than you and I would get if you were a progressive.
And of course, that's what's happening with these young men.
Yes, and that was my point, was coming back, so that they're having those conversations where they feel aggrieved, and then they can find that information on Reddit, because apparently that's a good source for these young white men to feel aggrieved. They can then find people where they find their people who are saying the things that make them feel better, whereas I'll be sitting there on Twitter with just my followers that I really like, or following people that have, because I don't want to hear the other opinions. I really don't, because they make me uncomfortable.
Yeah, and you don't want to be angry all the time.
I want to be angry all the time. And I feel like that's the issue, that's the problem we have right now. So we live in these little silos. We're constantly hearing the information that supports what we believe. If we're feeling like we're not being listened to and not being heard, we can find out our people on the internet, and we may never hear anyone else's point of view. And we may choose never to hear anyone else's point of view, like me right now, because yeah, you're right, I don't want to be angry all the time. So I think that's maybe the kind of thing that happened from that kind of, in the 90s, we seemed to be starting to get it, and then we went backwards because of the kind of media that we were putting out for young girls, particularly, how we were depicting women, you know, the sexualization of young girls wearing clothes that were the same as their mothers. And I mean, I've never studied this, so I don't know, but my feeling is that we ended up really drawing lines between men and women, and young girls 5, 6, and 7 were seeing it. Yeah. And that they really, they were starting to feel the divide in a way that I don't think I felt in the 70s, when we just wore our elasticized trousers and our skivvies. I think that when I talk to my younger kid, they'll say, actually, the impression they had was that boys were better. I've had that conversation and I'm shocked. I was absolutely shocked. And I think maybe because they didn't have brothers as well, it might have been a bit of difference. I had a brother, so I could tell that, you know, definitely that wasn't the case.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I was born in the early 50s, was raised as one of 3 girls. It probably had a lot to do with my mother, but I never felt that boys were better. But I did measure my self-worth for a long time with what men thought of me.
Yeah. And I think that that's tied into that, because I also don't know, that conversation that I had with my youngest might not have been the way they felt all the time, because clearly I didn't feel that. But I didn't see that because that was surprising, very successful kid. So but I wondered maybe going to a girls' school, and for some reason that may have reinforced that. But I think she said it was a lot to do with the kind of like things like Entourage on television, a lot of those things that you're being exposed to, where you're seeing that men get opportunities, and being in the entertainment business that they are involved in, it is still a very difficult environment, I think, for young women. And so it's possibly different kinds of experiences, but it's distressing that could have ever been, especially coming from my household. I have my eldest daughter is a very vocal gay woman, and she's very out there, and she's a scientist. So, and their dad is a feminist. So I think maybe that access to social media too, seeing those comments, had a difference.
Because my kids, well, they're not kids. Kirsty's 41 and Peter's 36. So they are half a generation different. It would be interesting to talk to them about how they felt about that.
Yeah. I think that not having social media, there's a sort of like before and after social media. Because I noticed it even, because my kids who are in their 20s now, they were at the beginning of like MSN, and they'd get home from school when they were at sort of an intermediate, and they'd be messaging their friends. So they already had that, they grew up at a time where they were constantly in contact with their peers.
Yeah.
When we went away, we used to go away and you never were in contact with any of your friends. Nowadays, they're constantly, I think it's a big pressure on teenagers. And also hearing things and seeing things that we would never have heard or seen because it just wasn't available to us. We had one TV channel and we watched the news every night, and we watched documentaries because New Zealanders were documentaries. By the time my kids were through, coming through, there was Sky Television. They had Tumblr and Facebook, and before that MySpace, and they were sort of at the beginnings of social media. And it was interesting to me. I could tell how when they'd be on the phone and they'd get a text, how their mood would change. It was, I wanted it, my initial thought for research for psychology was to look at that difference. I never did, but I think that I would be very surprised if it didn't have an impact on the way these kids grow up.
Oh, it has to.
I mean, good and bad.
So with the stuff that you've come across, like, you have to tell the story about not looking like a scientist, that photo and stuff.
So we live in strange times, and very recently my kids and I went on this March for Science. I have a PhD in health psychology, and my eldest daughter is in her final year of a PhD in biomedical science, so very legitimate scientist. And we had our very cool signs as we marched for science with Susie Wiles through the streets of Auckland. And there was a photograph of us on the front page of Stuff, which is a virtual news site in New Zealand. And the comments were hilarious. And there was a bloke who made the comment, you might remember it better than I do because you've read it recently, but to the effect that basically it was very unlikely we were scientists because of the way that we looked.
Yeah.
And then there was something else being fascists as well. I can't remember, like science fascists. It was
science fascism because people didn't necessarily agree with you and you were making them. But the bit that really got me was that because you were female and had a summer dress on, that you couldn't possibly be a scientist,
Well, my daughter-in-law was in a white coat. So there was my daughter-in-law.
It was.
So Mary was wearing a white coat. So clearly it wasn't about the white coat because one of us was wearing a white coat.
Yeah. So must have been because you're female.
It had to have been, and I guess that's a mark of the times as well. It was and so it comes back to what we were saying before. People probably thought that way, but now they feel very entitled to say it. And it's not tongue-in-cheek saying it. It's that we have an idea about what a scientist looks like. We have an idea about, possibly what an engineer looks like. We have all these ideas, and we are not seeming to be able to get away from those kind of stereotypes. And in many ways, we're probably, it's worse than it's ever been. And my thought about that is that we're going to have to start teaching kids from a very young age how to think critically again.
I think, yeah, because, yes, I was about to ask you, what do you think we can do about it? And it's that thinking critically, using some judgment.
Yep, I think that it's going to have to be there with reading and the writing and the maths, is that we start to have to equip kids to be able to evaluate information as it comes before them, because they're going to be given information couched as fact. It's not just opinion, it is completely, it's a lie. And this whole alternative facts universe that we live in,
God, yes,
is horrifying. And so that's really where my research is.
Yeah.
It's that what I've looked at is medically unexplained symptoms around wind farms, and that is where people have become sick and they're convinced that they're sick because when wind turbines turn, they produce a sound that you can't hear called infrasound. They think that they're being exposed to this and this is making them ill. And people report getting very sick, like very debilitated by it. And the science is there's nothing about infrasound that would cause the problem, the subaudible sound, because we're surrounded by infrasound all the time. It's normal. There's nothing pernicious about any of the sounds that you're being exposed to around a wind farm. But where we see people report symptoms, or where people have been exposed to this misinformation, is that wind farms make you sick.
Oh, and you see it everywhere.
Yeah. So if you do a little Google search, wind farms make you sick, you'll possibly come across my research, I'd hope, but you'll also come across a whole lot of information that's being exposed, that's being disseminated by so-called experts.
Yeah.
And if you looked at it, you'd be terrified, because so and such doctor has said that infrasound is going to make you ill, and it's couched in very scientific terms. So you say, you know, this doctor here has done some research and it shows that your inner ear is affected. It's all discredited and debunked science. But how do you know that when you're just an individual who's Googled something? But it's one thing that you're being exposed to misinformation. The problem is that when you're exposed to that misinformation, that is enough to make you sick. So not only are you frightened about reading this, you get sick. And initially that was just my hunch. So what I did was I gave people the information that's on the internet about people becoming sick around wind farms, and then I played them infrasound in a lab. And people who were accessing information from the internet that this infrasound was bad for them got incredibly unwell. They got headaches, nausea. I have had someone vomit. And the people that were told there's nothing wrong with infrasound, it's a very normal part of human experience. The wind creates infrasound. We are being exposed to infrasound all the time. It's always in the environment. We just don't know about it. They went into the lab and they didn't get sick at all. And because infrasound is subaudible, I could have a condition where they were being exposed to silence that was nothing. So you could show that what was causing people to become sick was nothing to do with the exposure to the sound, because they got sick when they were exposed to the infrasound, and they got sick when they were exposed to sham infrasound that they thought was infrasound, if they had been exposed to this misinformation on the internet. Something called the nocebo effect. So that is the power of misinformation. And we live at a time where it's not just about renewable energy, where people are saying you get sick around solar panels now. And that's the kind of information that you might want to spread if you've got interest in fossil fuels. You might be in your best interest for fossil fuel people to think, well, actually, it's better to go with the old traditional coal mining, because if you live around a solar panel or a wind farm, you're going to get sick. It's the most bizarre argument, but it works because it makes people frightened. And we know that's enough to make them sick, because expectations can make you unwell. And then we have these things where we see where you have anti-vaccination groups who put out information couched as science, saying the vaccine, MMR, measles, mumps and rubella vaccine causes autism, which unfortunately started with a report that was published in a medical journal, was published in the Lancet, and is now being completely discredited and retracted. But you live in a world where we're being given information all the time, and we need to be able to assess whether or not it's credible. And it's tricky, because how can you tell? So my feeling is that's the new thing we have to do, not just with dealing with misogyny and sexism and getting away from the idea that people are in silos and talking about things that reinforce their viewpoint, that we, from a young age, get people to challenge their biases, to understand that they have them, to be able to filter out information and to be able to assess whether or not information is credible or not. And if we don't start doing that, we are going to live in a world of alternative facts.
Yes, unfortunately. Well, thank you very much for that, Fiona. Is there anything else you want to add, that?
No, but I'm really excited about your project. Tell me about you for a minute. So what is this project that you've got? You're looking at women that are inspirational women. What made you think of this?
I started by thinking about, just started to become more horrified about the facts that we seem to have taken several steps backwards from, when I started university in 1969, and it was just, it's all rah-rah, and the first time people had heard about women's rights and everything, and having battled through and done, reasonably well done all the jobs that I've ever wanted to do, raise children who are very aware of all these things. And now to see, and it started about a year ago when I was reading about the awful, awful things that young women in universities are subjected to from their male colleagues. And then, of course, with Trump, it was starting to get worse. And I thought, well, there's no point just getting depressed about it. Let's start getting a few ideas about how we can start to deal with this and perhaps start work towards preventing it in the future. Not for everybody, obviously that's not possible, but at least for some young women and some young men. So I thought, well, how can I do that? So I, with gathering a bit of information, but mostly by talking to other women such as yourselves, who are bound to have some ideas about this, and talking about your own experiences as well and how you've dealt with that. So there you go.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm very excited, and I'll be excited to watch other women speak about their experiences, and maybe we'll be able to put out a little, toolkit of things that we think might be good.
That would be great. Well, yeah, it's been really exciting. And you're my first interviewee, so thank you very much for that. It's been great.
It was my pleasure. I hope that it sounded like a bit of a ramble. Hope it makes sense in the end.
I'm sure it does.
All right, my love. It was lovely to speak with you.
Okay, thanks very much.